Hi, everyone, and welcome to Rockin' Out with yours truly, J Rock. And today we're going to talk about episode 6 of Distorted Realities, which happened today, Memorial Day weekend. Um, so, I want to share my thoughts on a lot of the topics. So, we'll start off with the cryptid section, and I have two important pieces I thought were interesting. The first one was El Vampiro de Mocha, or the Vampire of Mocha, right? Another lore from Puerto Rico, specifically from the town of Mocha. And my thoughts on it, right? But before I give you my thoughts, I'm going to share a little bit of background. So this was in the 1970s. Apparently, there was a gentleman who was attacked by a creature at 10 o'clock or so at night. He is a farmer. He was on his way home, and apparently he was attacked, and he kind of fought back and made his way home, contacted the local township sheriffs or whoever the police department was over there in Puerto Rico at the time. And it was a documented case, which was extremely interesting. This actually made headlines in the newspapers. So in Puerto Rico, you have several news reports that were always, the top, right? The first one was called El Diario, right? The Daily in Spanish. And then you had El Vocero, which was like the voice, right? And these particular newspaper articles stood the test of time. And Mr. Frank Walls was the one in charge of doing the research and the legwork. And he got the articles, and I said, "Oh, this is a great piece. Let's go for it." And after reviewing it, my thoughts differ from his. I feel like perhaps this was an antithesis to the Chupacabra, or perhaps it was the Chupacabra and people just didn't understand it the way people today do. I was a little bit perplexed because the descriptions didn't match, but it's like the old story goes, you describe things one way and over time it gets described differently. But the mechanisms by which it attacks and the fact that it was spotted attacking livestock, there was a lot of consistencies and similarities. And I said, you know what? In my mind, this was just the Chupacabra in its infancy. Maybe it survived and it developed and it became something different, because evolution has a way to deal with animals and growth and changes, no different than a moth or a caterpillar would become a butterfly. So there is a possibility, and I say to keep that with an open mind, right? Because those kind of transformations can be very exaggerated. For example, in the Vampire Mocha, it was a winged-like creature with feathers, right? Now, when they said winged-like creatures, I said, okay, probably it was a species of bat we never heard of. But when they said feathers, I said, okay, that's weird, because I never seen a feathered bird with fangs, right? So that kind of had my head spinning a bit. But I think sometimes tales get exaggerated, or in the midst of the incident, people see certain things or they exaggerate that truth because they were in the moment. I think it's the Chupacabra, to be quite frank. No pun intended, because this is Frank's favorite thing. So yeah, he's a big fan of the Chupacabra. But with that being said, I found it interesting either way. Another local legend. And I think these are the kind of discussions that need to be had. There's so many great stories that come from local lore. And I think as we keep digging, right, these great stories come out. And yeah, sometimes they match up to something that we already know about. But the fact that it's a documented case, that there's actual evidence, that there's some kind of newspaper clipping or video or report, makes it for a great story for us to present to you, the audience. So yeah, I found the Vampiro de Mocha very interesting, although I still think it's the Chupacabra. So the next one I want to talk about, and I found really interesting, was the Ningen. Why? Because it segued to the episode before, which was episode 5. We was talking about what lies under the oceans of the north. And here we are looking at a cryptid that is in the subantarctic ocean. It's described as a humanoid giant being with whale-like features, right? There's an actual submarine recording of this creature in the water swimming, and this is probably by happenstance, right? But a creature nonetheless. something that cannot be explained, something that is now been adapted to Japanese culture as folklore, right? And this is the part of exploration that makes things exciting. You're getting to see something you've never saw before. Stuff that's written in fairy tales, in books, and magazines, and science fiction, and fantasy articles. Here it is, you know? So that's why I fell in love with the whole Ningen character or creature, because it kind of was a shot in the dark. And this is not too long ago. 2007 is not that far back. All right. So yeah, those were my thoughts on the cryptids. My thoughts on the alien segment was my favorite one personally was the Almahuluk Strat 163, right? Or ALMA for short. So in this case, I found that when a species wants to come in and there's some kind of great war that takes place, you kind of try to find the consistencies and parallels. And guess what? The Hindu text has wars and books, right? I believe they're called the Vedas. And these books actually depict a war in the sky between species. Now, what's so cool about this is they had these amazing machines that were like spaceships, right? And we already know, based on history and documented stories, that there is a reptilian race called the Reptoids, right? And who's to say that this is not possible, right? That this species, a highly advanced technological species, got defeated by a reptilian species, and they had to leave, only to come back later. If to be more exact, in 1948, they made another appearance, and that's when they started to come back. Now, why is this so important? Well, how cultures are built are important. If you look at the ancient astronaut theory, right? Someone teaches a civilization or a group of people to become civilized, and they teach them about culture, right? How to behave, how to make fire, how to do certain things that in principle makes perfect sense. And this is even depicted in mythological stories, right? So who's to say that this is not possible, that those Greek gods, those deities, or those specific people that sit on a specific pantheon or religion that taught fire isn't necessarily an alien species, right? It makes perfect sense if you want to open your mind a little bit and think about that is a possibility. You know, and the ancient astronaut theory is very acceptable in today's society. So what this won't make it any different. The other thing I like about it is, it's Hindu culture, right? They're very ornate and very detailed about their history. Unfortunately, inside of today's economy, they don't fare so well. But in spite of that, they're rich in culture. And that's something to look at, right? They preserve their ancient temples, their sites, their history. It's all there. And this can be a discovery, right? If it's true that this is the species responsible for it. And I think it makes for a great case. So let's talk about the creepy stuff. The duendes, the Namerigar, the fairies, the hobbits, all these creatures that are small in stature, right? These are mythological creatures. Now, when I was a kid, I am to this day a big fan of fantasy, right? Because it takes you on a heroic quest. And inside of that heroic quest, well, you come to learn that the journey is just as important as you slaying the dragon. Because you meet these interesting creatures, fabled in lore, with magical abilities, with the ability to turn the tide into your favor, right? They add on and complement your journey, right? And sometimes you create a party of members that go with you on that journey because they want to see it through with you. And that's what I remember about these creatures. And a lot of them were small. They were called dwarfs, and they had battle axes, and they almost looked like small miniature Nordic figures with these battle axes and swords and armor that was crafted by some ancient special blacksmith. Then you had fairies that had magical fairy dust and will allow you to levitate or perform some kind of special trait. You had wizards, right? The concept that I'm trying to bring about is that these are beautiful tales that are told in fantasy to incite intrigue and allure, because there's something majestic about how we look at things when we hear it. It gets romanticized, it's beautified, right? But when you look at a book like Grimm's fairy tales, right, and you see that everything that's beautiful is really not, it kind of lets you challenge that story a little bit, or challenge the narrative, right? Because there is a dark side. You need the polarity to exist in order for you to look at it. You can't have a yin without a yang, but you can't have a good story without a bad guy, right? Well, in this case, I hate to break it to you, I believe in this a lot. I believe a lot of these creatures are not what they were made out to be. I think that these creatures in specific were very primal. If they are real and they have not evolved to the way we have, and they still live in these small places that are in the outskirts of nowhere, they're going to not evolve to the point where they're going to comprehend this. They're going to be very protective, very primal in their behavior, and very tribal, because there has to be a sense of power and control, right? Some of these creatures I don't believe to be true. I haven't seen a human with wings. Yeah, I've seen it in videos and it might be interesting, but with the power of AI and CGI, anything's possible, right? So I don't believe in every single one, but I do believe in some. And for an example, duendes in Mexico, you know, it's very real out there. You know, when you go look at those places, you know, people don't even want to mention it. They don't want to talk about it because they've seen them. And there's documented cases and recorded cases that defy logic, and even older footage that is very unlikely possible to use CGI on. Like, this is like really old stuff. And I'm talking about 1980s, early 90s, where CGI wasn't at its peak. It was very noticeable when it was CGI. And then you have the story about hobbits, right? What makes it so intriguing? The Tolkien books from Lord of the Rings and all these tales already made mention of the hobbits, right? But then you have National Geographic discovering a new species of humanoids that were very small. And when I mean small, abnormally small. So I'm not talking about the current spectrum of heights, because you do have people that are short in stature. They're referred to as midgets or any inappropriate word that I personally don't like to use. I just call them little people, but it's based on their size, on their bone structures and things of that nature. They already identified and classified. So who's to say that another species much smaller doesn't exist? Another thing to consider is that in the prehistoric times, it is scientifically proven that there was an abundance of oxygen. Trees were bigger, animals were huge, insects were 8 times their size, right? And this is in the fossil record, so it's not like it doesn't exist. Who's to say that there weren't species that were affected negatively, and that a humanoid species could have shrunk because there was not enough oxygen supply in that area, right? We know things get smaller when there's less oxygen. And to prove it to you, what happens when you swim underneath water? Your body wants to shrink. It wants to decompress, right? So it's the same thing in theory, just with not being in the water. And the same thing can be proven when you're in different altitudes. You know, when there's a lack of oxygen, you get tired faster, you feel weaker, you don't feel vibrant, versus being in an area where there is an abundance of air, you feel like you can do a lot more. So those are my thoughts. You know, I think some of it is real when it comes to the duendes and the small cryptids. I think some of them are not. I think some of them are viable, justifiable, and can probably have some kind of medical explanation behind it. But it makes for a great case. So just to recap, Vampiro de Moca, I think that it's a very interesting case, but I just think it's the origin story of the Chupacabra. All right. In terms of the Ningen, it kind of proves that there's more to be explored underwater. And I love a cryptid that can show up and make a statement like that without being an aggressive, crazy monster. In terms of Almahuluk, Strat 163, it makes for a good talking point regarding an alien species that can create change in the human race and incite something positive like the creation of a culture, of a language, and these are all ideas, okay? And lastly, duendes and small people, from the mythological and cryptid side of things. I think there's a good case for all of it. And with that, I think it was an interesting episode. What I encourage people to do when they watch these episodes, these are talking points. Distorted Realities is this talk show where you're supposed to jump in, ask questions. We may not have all the answers, but it's for you to explore. Discover your own truth. Look into the unknown and discover your own truth. And I think that's the best way I look at things. I don't believe in everything, but I think some of it makes for a great story. Others make for an interesting case. And some of it can be very real. And with that, I'm signing off. Thank you for watching Rockin' Out with yours truly, J-Rock. And stay tuned on Sundays for Distorted Realities, every Sunday at 5. And remember, like and subscribe. See you then.